and how do we take research and other kinds of knowledge and mobilize them so that they'll have an impact on solutions to homelessness. It can be seen as a complex thing to do, but it's an important way to think about our work. One of the things that I would say is true, I can't speak for every university. I know York takes knowledge mobilization seriously, but I think most people, academics, are trained in very traditional ways to think about dissemination and impact, right? So I've read a lot of knowledge mobilization proposals and grants where people are like, well, I'm going to present at conferences and write scholarly peer-reviewed articles, which are very important, but there's a whole lot more that we can do with the research. But the first question we have to ask, because I'll start with the story from a colleague in the Faculty of Education once, who says to me, you know, research has zero impact on policy. And I said, what makes you say that? She says, well, I published an article that was critical of the Ministry of Education and nothing changed. And I thought, well, there's good reason for that, you know, because our traditional way of thinking about dissemination, as I say, doesn't necessarily get to the people that you want to influence. And it also, but her statement does beg an important question. Does research matter? Because lots of people will feel like government ignores research, everybody ignores research. And in these days with the pandemic, it's easy to see that notions of truth and validity are openly questioned all over the place. So a key challenge in the world of homelessness has been the role of research evidence. And I would say until the At-Home Chez Soi project, the impact of research on how we address homelessness has been quite limited and hasn't had the impact that it should. So the question is, how do we create impact? And it's considered that there are like 4 main uses of research. Sandra Nutley is a major scholar on research impact and knowledge mobilization. And the first one is around conceptual research. So what is the big idea that you have that your research will help enlighten us to do things differently? With our Making the Shift project, it's very clear that prevention of homelessness, which is almost a dirty word in North America, should play a bigger role. And so our transformation agenda is to help move the dial in that area. And so there is research that does that. This is a document we did that basically created a definition of the prevention of homelessness and a typology, a lit review. The intention was to insert that out there into the public space so that we could start having conversations about maybe we could do things differently. Instrumental uses of research are ones that basically focus on existing policies and practices to determine the effectiveness of things, what works for whom and in what contexts. And so program evaluation is instrumental research. And that's important research as well, because I would argue outside of permanent supportive housing and housing first, very little of what gets done in the world of homelessness has a research evidence base. Symbolic use of research is important too, and this can be used in different ways, both positively and negatively. So we did a report several years ago on the cost of keeping people in a state of homelessness. And that was to raise questions. It was conceptual, but it was also symbolic in that we were making the statement that it's actually cheaper to house people than to keep them in a state of homelessness. And then the process use of research is when organizations that aren't research organizations per se begin to engage in conducting research, it changes their culture, their organization culture. Because if you're doing evaluation is the flip side of the planning coin, right? You have to start thinking about objectives and outcomes and these kinds of things. So these are all valuable things. These should be valuable things when we're trying to address youth homelessness. And to answer the question, I'm a believer that research can matter, does matter, but we have to do more than just publish. That won't get us where we need to be. So traditional mode of dissemination, I'm going to try and go through this quickly. This is about how we're taught to publish. So there's lots of pressure on people to publish academic articles in peer-reviewed journals, which are perfectly fine. It's an established practice. But there's something about the way this is structured in the world that I have a lot of problems with, right? We have the researchers over here who create the knowledge. And then over here, we have the publication and dissemination of it, which is generally done by somebody else. In most cases by peer-reviewed academic journals, right? So us researchers are doing the creation, the creative work, the evidence-based work, and the academic institutions reward people for doing that work, in particular if they're published in peer-reviewed journals. And the publishing, though, is done by a whole other industry, which is typically not academic-led. The publishing industry is highly profitable, the publication industry for research. And here's why. Because unlike if we were writing for the New York Times or the Atlantic Monthly or pick any journal or magazine, the authors get paid. But what we do as researchers is we give them our creative material. We peer review it if we're asked. And if they come back to us and say, you're going to be published, we're, oh, goody, I'm now published in an academic journal. So the point is, it's highly profitable because the academic journals don't have to pay for the content. Moreover, they have a monopoly and they shake down universities, right? So universities, all the free access you have as a student or a faculty member is because the university is paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to these companies. These companies make in excess of 30% profit. I'd say that's better than building condos, right? It's highly profitable. And we don't critique that much in academia, even those of us who would be on the more critical left side. We participate in it, is what we do. And so alongside of that issue, which began, by the way, in the 60s when large-scale communications companies started buying up academic journals and assembling portfolios, we now also have the rise of a whole bunch of journals that are totally sketchy. They want you to pay to get published. They're usually not peer-reviewed. They're kind of, I hate to say fake journals because that sounds a little like Donald Trump, but it's what they are, right? And so you will find, if you haven't already, as your career advances, you will get requests for publications daily from very strange journals. I get them from, like, you know, medical journals and all kinds of things. Eric, I'm guessing your mailbox gets filled with these kind of things too, where they'll pick one article you've written in the past. We want you to write something like that again. So the whole industry, it makes me kind of dubious. And I'm going to close with one last thing. So this is an article published in 1963. So that's 50 plus years ago. Now have a look at it, the layout, and here's one from 50 years later. Now, what you'll see is the typeface is different, but the structure is pretty much the same and the process is pretty much the same. And now, if you want to influence people, like service providers or people in government, give them something like this, and you're pretty sure they're not going to read it. Loaded with the jargon that it is. And so a question I have, if you look here again, right, like, what's the difference here? Can you think of any other medium in the last 50 years that has relatively unchanged? I mean, the journals are online now, but it's still the same thing. Whether it's magazines, movies, television, radio, all of these things transform themselves, but academic journals don't because they don't have to. So, so that's a problem on its own. And you'll see why I'm raising that issue in a minute. But what we're concerned with is not, saying we shouldn't publish peer-reviewed articles. I absolutely think we should. But we need to do more. And we need to, if our goal is knowledge mobilization, we need to really figure out what that more is. And so we start with implementation science, which is a relatively new field of inquiry. It is basically to look at, like, how do we move from creation in academia and in sciences to having those creations be taken up in policy and practice. And a lot of that research comes from health sciences and STEM sciences, where there's a commercialization angle to the work. But it's informative in understanding what's necessary. So this model here is kind of like a typical knowledge mobilization model. It's fairly linear. You start with figuring out what you want to do, then you do the research. Then initially people will start taking it up, and then eventually you'll get widespread use. It doesn't explain how that works, but it kind of lays it out. But I want you to look at this bar at the bottom. It takes minimally 2 to 4 years for there to be any uptake, right? And so we have to be patient. Right? So you might write the best report you've ever done. You might write the most fantastic article you've ever done, but it can take years before it actually has an impact out there. And so patience is important in our work. So if to define knowledge mobilization, let's start with the second line here. We want to have some kind of impact with our work. We want something to happen, some kind of change. If that's the kind of research we're doing, not everyone needs to do that kind of research, but if you're in that space, like we want to change the way homelessness is responded to, we're talking about impact. But knowledge mobilization answers the question, what do we do to get there, right? And it's useful to think about the different techniques that we need to engage in. And David Phipps at York University, he's leading internationally renowned expert on knowledge mobilization, talks about central to the work has to be, before the research even, you need to have that community engagement where community and the campus are partners in the work. And so that's what will get you to uptake, because researchers working alone generally aren't going to get that kind of impact. So how do we achieve research impact? This is a complex question that it comes out of research now, because it's very difficult to definitively say this article I published, except in some rare cases, but this article I published led to a change in policy. Policy making is complicated. There are many factors that can influence it. So we now tend to talk more about attribution versus contribution. So rather than attribute a change that's happened out there in the world to our research, it's better if we talk about our role in contributing to the change. This is a great article by Sarah Morton that talks about this. And so here's the thing, right? So you can have great content, a great article, important results, groundbreaking. And so when you disseminate, the first thing you do is people come in touch with your research potentially, or that's the mechanism. So the dissemination part through peer-reviewed journals, that kind of thing, puts it out in the world. The next step is that somebody who you want to influence has to be aware of it. And so you have to ask yourself how many, especially because it costs so much money to get access to academic articles because of the firewall and the profit making of these companies. How are you going to make people aware of your research? No matter how good it is, how are you going to do that? They need to then understand it. So you publish the research, you disseminate it, you get the people you want, you send out copies to people in government or in service providers. How do you know they're going to read it? And if they do, then they'll get some understanding about it. But that's still a long way from uptake, right? So the person reads it, they might go, that's a load of crap, or I don't understand it, or I'm too busy. The positive perception becomes important. If it's like, wow, that's changed the way I think about this, I'm going to think about it. Then people might start to experiment. This is where the uptake starts to happen, where people take the knowledge that you've produced and put it into action. That's the crucial point that you want to really understand. If the stakeholder adopts it, that's when you're starting to have impact. And if it becomes incorporated and integrated across your organization and the way it works, that's where you have success, right? But getting there, this is called the commitment curve, right? That helps you understand the pathway of knowledge and where it's going to have impact. So that all of that's going to be key into your thinking, right? Like, again, you have to go beyond dissemination. What are you going to do? So we're going to talk about some key building blocks for knowledge mobilization. The first is to go back to the David Phipps comment about partnerships and collaboration. You really need to work together with not just other academics, although that's important too, but you need to work together with, depending on what you're trying to influence, organizations that share your visions or desires, and work in a way that's equal, where you're able to like balance the pressures that each institution has and the practices that each institution holds, and somehow work together to find common ground to produce something really valuable. So making our most productive, we've worked collaboratively with a lot of organizations, both national and regional and local, and continue to do that. Perhaps our most important collaboration has been with Away Home Canada, which has been around for about 6 years. And so we've done a lot of work in the youth homelessness space, including launching Making the Shift. So that's really key to the work. And we couldn't have done it if it was just the observatory. We couldn't have had this kind of success. So always look to collaboration and do it in meaningful ways and learn from it. And you'll find that rather than it be something scary, it produces much better results. The second thing is to understand your end users. So who do you want to influence, right? And so for, this is a real important question. For us with Making the Shift, we want to influence policymakers in all orders of government, so municipally, provincially, and territorially, federally. We want to influence other researchers. We want to influence service providers. We want to influence community entities that coordinate homelessness services. We want to influence the general public. And so when you start to think about all of these potential groups of interest, you have to really work out, okay, how are we going to do that? How do we do that beyond dissemination, right? And so one of the challenges that we face as the observatory and Making the Shift is that it comes from a belief of ours that we have to both do peer-reviewed scientific articles, which we do, but we also have to have public-facing knowledge products, right? And if we want to influence people in government or service providers, it's the latter that's going to be more effective than the former, right? The former gives us a type of legitimacy, but the latter is where we have the big impact. And it's interesting because on more than one occasion, I've had students or young scholars tell me, my professor told me never publish anything with the Homeless Hub. You should only publish in peer-reviewed journals. And that's people's choice, but we do the public-facing work because that's where we believe is the uptake. And we need to have productive interactions with all of those groups we're talking about. So we go to academic conferences, but we engage people working in the sector, from frontline workers to decision makers to community entities, municipal governments. Like we can't deal with them all, right? But we work where we can. And we do that not just because we're trying to influence them, but we also need to understand their pressures and stresses, their questions around capacity, their desires, because that will help us mobilize the research more effectively. Like, what makes you tick? What are the things that are really hard from where you work? Your research makes it sound so easy, but we've been doing this work for 20 years and our board wants us to only do this kind of thing. You know, there are all kinds of challenges that get in the way of transformation. And so understanding through productive interactions who you want to engage with is really important. Now, design thinking and dissemination. I'm going to look at my time here, make sure okay. I'm going to move quickly through this. So one of the things we did early on when we started the Homeless Hub and the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness is, like, one of my big expectations was that our research looked really good. And that may sound funny, but it matters, because I want someone to pick the thing up off the desk and go, I'm going to flip through that. It's part of how you engage people. And so we apply design thinking in terms of our publication, right? So that's where we integrate not just the content that the researchers produce, but we think very carefully about what exactly we need to produce that will be helpful to the service providers or people in government, and do a lot of work on that. And all of this is to try and create an impact. And we draw, so you saw me talking before about academic publishing. We draw some of our thinking about design thinking, goes back to Walter Benjamin, who in the 1930s was talking about the advance of technology. And he was talking about art and saying, you know, that, you know, whether it's visual arts or written work. And he was saying that, you know, in the same way that I was talking about academic publishing, you know, companies control dissemination, and that the artist should be the publisher. With technology advancing, and think again, it's like 1932, technology advancing the way it is, why can't we take control of the publication? And so that thinking really sticks and resonates with us in our work. And so, whoops, I'm going to skip that. And so the Homeless Hub was created with that idea in mind, that we'll be our own publisher and disseminator. And we don't care if other people take our stuff and put it on their website. That's good news, right? We use a Creative Commons approach to intellectual property. So, you know, take it away and use it. If you're going to take content from it, just make sure you use citations, that kind of thing. And so the actual content involves a lot of creative work, right? So we use plain language, make sure it's as clear as possible, and a lot of graphic design work on this. We do what's called content layering. So at the bottom, we have the research report, then an executive summary. That's not so interesting. But then we have plain language summaries, like 2 or 3 pagers, then blogs, infographics, all the way up to the tweet, which is perhaps our smallest knowledge product. But it can be the most impactful, right? For somebody who's very busy, it might be, oh, wow, I never thought of this. This is important. I remember years ago, we released a report on the criminalization of homelessness. Nice graphic design, great content, one of my favorite research projects. And after about, and what we would typically do in those days is Stephanie, director of communications, would say, Steve, we need a video. Can you put one together on the report? So I just go into another room, video myself talking for 8 minutes. She'd edit it down to a pop song size for social media, and off we go. And so with that report on criminalization of homelessness, after a year, we looked at the analytics and found that more people watched the video than looked at the report. And so while that was kind of disheartening, it was a good message. is that don't discount all these other things as ways of getting the knowledge you have into the right hands. And so this is kind of layering in action, right? So we have the report, we have infographics, tweets, videos, it's all there, blogs. You wrap it around, and our thinking on how to do this is evolving, by the way. I just see a sign now that says participants can now see the application. I hope people were able to see what I was talking about. Otherwise, it might seem kind of strange. The final thing is about human-centered design. So this isn't so much about publication, but if we're doing research on interventions or policies, and this is part of design thinking too, we have to really think about where do we start, right? So we need to understand through using arts-based methods or interviews or hanging out or watching, with people and work with them who are experiencing the thing that you're studying. We co-create with those very people, like young people, and then we prototype an intervention that's based on everything we co-created and learned. And it's important because the work we were doing on trying to support young people who are homeless, we start by talking with young people who have been couch surfing or whatever. And what you find is that nobody says, I woke up today, I'm 14, and I thought what my family needs is some good family mediation support, right? Like that's not where people go. What people do is they talk to their friends, they may talk to a doctor or a nurse, the friends, parents or neighbors, teachers or counselors, relatives, a coach or instructor, a faith leader. There's all kinds of people that they may talk to. None of those are the homelessness sector. And so if we're going to design ways to get preventive supports to young people, we need to be thinking about this human-centered design approach. And how do we equip people who are just members of the general public or people in professions to be helpful? What's needed to make it helpful? And so we have to do human-centered design with them as well, right? Like what would make it easier for you rather than something extra to do? Okay, so we'll move on now to, and the final piece then is this obviously opens the door for acknowledging, recognizing in a meaningful way the importance of engaging people with lived experience of youth homelessness in the work. And that's at any stage or any part of this whole research project. So let's put it all together. Okay, I'm going to go through quickly on some of this. Social innovation is important because it helps us solve what are called wicked problems, which is an actual term. Refers to like complex policy and practice issues for which there are no single sector or organization can solve it. It requires collaboration. And so we set up Making the Shift, the Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab that started in about 2017, received a Networks of Centers of Excellence grant in 2019. And so it's co-led, right? And we had to break some rules. This is the first grant of this kind that was co-led. They're structured to have the research lead and then everyone else, that kind of thing. And our goal is here. I'm not going to read it because I hate when people read slides. But basically it's a transformation agenda where we want to shift minds, practices towards the prevention of youth homelessness. And so we have a research to impact cycle that's similar to the one that I showed you before, the linear one, where we've got these different pieces going on. So I'm going to go through some of this quickly. So assessment of, there's some slides missing here. Okay. We start by figuring out what we know about prevention of youth homelessness, who we know is doing it, what are they doing, and what is not being done. And from there, we go on to prioritize for research and resource development. And so research leading up to making the shift included the very first national survey on youth homelessness, the middle document, A New Direction, a framework for homelessness prevention, and this consultation we did with young people with lived experience. This led to the creation of what is our holy book, the Roadmap for the Prevention of Youth Homelessness, which deals with the conceptual framing of what we need to do, backed by evidence as to what's going on out there that will work. The second thing then is to do the research itself. So Making the Shift has these 5 interlocking theme areas. If you can go to the website, if you Google Making the Shift Inc., you can get more details about it. We've currently funded 31 different research projects focusing on the prevention of youth homelessness in Canada. Eric, yours is one of them. And so that's going to create some major knowledge. This is, we figure, without having sure evidence, this is probably the largest investment there has ever been on research on prevention of youth homelessness. But we also do demonstration projects. And this is where we take concepts or ideas that are actually out there in practice or that we've developed and test them out in real world conditions, right? So it means program design and prototyping, giving more structure to what is the program. It means doing research and evaluation. So answering the questions, how does this work? How do we know it works? Because I'm pretty sure there are a lot of things out there that where claims are made for this is effective where there's no evidence. And what are the conditions that make something successful? So we've done a series of Canadian demonstration projects. I'm going to go through these quickly. Again, you can find out more about these on our website, but it basically builds on the roadmap, things that we identified that are important. So we do a lot of, we've got 8 projects funded on enhancing family and natural supports, which apparently is a fairly radical idea in working with young people experiencing homelessness. We do work on school-based early intervention. Why? Because every young person who's homeless was in school once, and there's real possibility an adult in their life knew something was wrong but didn't know what to do. So that includes Youth Reconnect and the UPSTREAM project. And Housing First for Youth is an intervention. The first example that I know of was with the Boys and Girls Clubs of Calgary. We work with them and with other community partners and with young people with lived experience to take the Housing First model, which many felt didn't work well for youth, and redesign it to work for the needs of developing adolescents and young adults. So we're testing all of these out in the field. So we've got 3 of these sites in Ontario right now. The one in Hamilton is Indigenous-led. The research is Indigenous-led. So a lot of knowledge is being produced here. So then you start to have the knowledge in your hand, right? You're starting to get results and something you want to share. What are you going to do? So there's a phase where you're going to start disseminating it. You're going to have to develop resources. You have to get the reports out there. You need to get the publications. You need a communications and marketing strategy or to think about it. I don't want to make it sound like only institutions can do this work. Anybody can do it. It just requires different scale and different tools. You're going to need to support early implementation because even though you would prefer that communities wait until the results are in, once people are hearing about what's going on, they want to try out the project and work, which is good. We support peer-to-peer learning and communities of practice because it's one thing for us to go and provide, documents. It's another for us to help with training and technical assistance. But at some point, people want to talk to other service providers about how to do this work well. So we develop resources. One of the big things we do is program model toolkits. This is our most recent version where we took our This is Housing First for Youth and broke it into 2 documents, one a program model guide and the other an operations manual that gives very in-depth information about how to implement the intervention, but also how to support young people. And we constantly communicate. We have over 20,000 subscribers to our newsletter. So we push things out. So dissemination is important, but the full implementation, and April, just so you know, I'm be done in just a few more minutes here. Community engagement's a big deal. There was a period where I was traveling a lot, as was Melanie Redman, to do presentations. You would be amazed at how often people will say, I saw you do a presentation in Perth, Ontario, and that led to us deciding we wanted to do such and such. So that kind of engagement is really important, and shouldn't be knocked at all. So webinars are important for all of you young researchers. Like, doing webinars is a great way because it also keeps a permanent record of that kind of communication. The training and technical assistance is growing in importance. Communities may, if you think of that commitment curve, maybe, yeah, we get this, we're excited by this, we want to do this, but we're not, and we've read all your stuff, but we're not quite sure how to do it. So we get experts in the area to do the work to help shift practice, right? So part of it might be like, how do we change the mindset of an organization to embrace this work, but also how to actually do them in the field. And so, so we do hands-on coaching, in-depth training. We have practical tools. We support communities of practice. We've got, we're training and technical assistance. This is all run through Away Home Canada and through Making the Shift. All of these are designed to get the supports out there so that communities can implement the knowledge that we've been producing. We work with communities when they're doing system planning to see if they can integrate some of these prevention thinking and preventive interventions in their planning processes. Because most of the training for community planning in North America doesn't really focus on prevention much at all. Government relations and government engagement. This is important one, and it's a challenging one. So to do this work well, you need to work to understand the role of research and policy and decision making. Because we generally, I never got trained on any of this in any of my university experience, but you start to pick up things that you think are true, like, governments only want quantitative data. That's absolutely not true. Absolutely not true. They appreciate both. And what you will find is that on the political side, they often appreciate the qualitative data more because it's about stories, right? So you also need to understand, like, how do decisions get made in government? How is it structured? Where in the what is a policy cycle, and where does this work fit? So the other thing is to avoid making assumptions, and this is including around partisanship. You might think that because of certain political parties in power that it's all hopeless. But sometimes innovation comes in those contexts. You had under Harper a government that overall was not positively inclined to research and was openly hostile, but they funded the at-home Chiswa project, right? And so you have to be open. A key thing in working with government is to figure out how what you want to have happen aligns with what they're interested in. So if you go into and say, talk to the person, the Minister of Education, and say, we think that we've got these great interventions on preventing youth homelessness. We think you should fund these and support these. You'll get, yeah, no, we're education institutions. And we don't see our job as addressing youth homelessness. But if you go in and say, we have these interventions that are really good to support young people, to help them stay engaged with school, and to contribute to their well-being and to student success, then they're listening, because those are the goals of education, right? Engagement, success, well-being. You have a better chance if you can align that in some way, because then it's like, by the way, you'll also be reducing youth homelessness. And so you have to think about that. In doing government relations, you have to engage both the political side and the public service side. They're very different beasts. The political side is where decisions get made, but the contacts you make can change very rapidly with a change of government or a cabinet shuffle, that kind of thing. And the public service, though, is usually there to stay. And they both have roles to play, and both can be influential with each other. So if you can engage on both sides, and find allies and build, all of this is about building relationships. It really helps. And then finally, I'm putting about recommendations. This would require not maybe a full webinar, but it's really important. Recommendations are a form of technical writing, and there are certain tricks that are important in it. Never write recommendations that are generalized, like the government should do such and such, because that will have no impact. You need to be specific. The Ministry of Education needs to do such and such. The Ministry of Community Safety needs to do this, and really like go to where in government you want to see the impact happen. And so we've done a lot of work over the years on developing that. And so in a lot of our reports, we have recommendations at the end if you want to see some examples of how those work. And the final thing I want to say about government relations is that if you use your research to embarrass the government, you will get no traction. Because especially some governments keep track of that. They do keep lists. If you go in with a critique, but with answering the so whatness, like if you can go in to be seen as being helpful, you're more likely to get someone to listen to you. I remember someone in a provincial government who was a senior person in their child protection ministry who said, we were so relieved when you put out this report because we were worried you were going to say what a terrible job we're doing. And she said, we know we're doing a terrible job, so telling us that wouldn't have helped. He came forward with things that are going to be helpful, and that's meaningful. And then finally, and I'm wrapping it up now so we can have questions. With our Making the Shift, we have project outcomes that we want we want it to be successful, want to have great research from different researchers. We want uptake in policy and practice, but the real impact that we're looking for is not just a reduction in youth homelessness, but really enhancing well-being, making better outcomes for young people and their families. That's really what this is all about. So I'm going to stop sharing that now, and I'm going to open it up to any questions. So April, you're the host.
That was great, Steve. I really enjoyed that. Every time I listen to you speak, I learn something new, and I've opened it up for questions in the chat. I don't see anything at the moment, but I do see Eric's hand is raised.
Only because I finally have him in person to talk to. I just wonder what you think the role of visual texts, using visual tools to make these reports are.
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. And I think they're absolutely important, right? Like if we could make it into a rock song, I'd say music is good, although there isn't much rock music nowadays, but visual communication is absolutely key, right? And I know you've done a lot of work in this area, and they achieve different things, right? Like they're different processes. And so we use whatever we can. Like we do some video work, but I think that's an area where we've been having conversations about improving. Visual materials are particularly good for social media.
Well, so I think if you don't mind, part B of that would be, there's this notion of public sociology, public ethnography, public social science, which is kind of like a multimedia approach to getting the message across. And one of the things I said in the chat that the other day I was actually doing an interview about the policies that that the election is bringing out, and I said it's funny. I hear these people talking about definitions of homelessness and poverty and youth issues and blah blah blah, but none of them seem to access these reports that all of us know about, and they don't seem to ever see. So I suggested that I said to the guy at the CBC that you guys need to read these as well. So I think that part of the problem is that even though we all believe in public approaches to this kind of work, that maybe the public or the people that need to look at the public forms are ignoring them? Is that possible?
Well, I think in government, the way it would work is we will, if we have a report we think is important, we will send it to every minister of every order of government. And they all have executive assistants working for them. They vet it and then report up. And so I think, and so there are cases where it's like, yes, they have read it, both on the public service side and the political side, but there are lots of cases where they don't, right? And there's all kinds of reasons why they don't. And it could be because I actually would hate those jobs. I would never want to be in, you know, because there's so, they'd be bombarded and they have to be experts on all these different issues. So, and we're competing in a world where there's all kinds of information that is up against us that will appeal to people. I think getting people interested in homelessness is inherently challenging, right? It's a stigmatized status. You know, it's not a vote getter for government, right?
It's hard to consume the information. We have so much of it and so much knowledge about it now that it's hard for everyday people to consume this.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, and even if they do, like, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you think of vaccination and the pandemic and really solid science doesn't always move minds, right? So you have to do what you can and be positive and seek the changes that you can and be patient.
Thank you.
We have a question from Elaine, and she says, I'm meeting with capital P Power, and while he has experience with the issue of students from poverty in another country, a Canadian perspective, and when coming from a poverty class student, will be new. What do I do with my 15 minutes to have impact? What solid solutions that we want taken? We have solid solutions that we want taken seriously.
Okay, so you got 15 minutes. I think you think about it as a story, right? And when I write reports, it's often what I do. Like there's a story arc. So, you know, what's the problem that we're looking at here? What's the state of it? And you're kind of like, wow, this is really bad. Then it's like, but wait, there's hope. What do you mean there's hope? We have some knowledge about what to do differently. And this should be of interest to you. So take people on just a narrative journey with your 15 minutes and try to, whoever it is, like try to figure out what, as I said before, what makes them tick. And if they have an interest that aligns with, it doesn't have to be exact with what you want to do, but if it aligns with it, you're likely to get someone to listen.
That's great. And we have one more question that we're going to try to squeeze in. This comes from Manisha, and she asks, what are your suggestions about collaborating with rural municipalities and reserves for youth homelessness?
Oh, it's a hugely important thing. And if you think about prevention, that's where a lot of the effort has to go, right? Whether it's a rural reserve or a rural indigenous community or a small town, or, you know, like part of the reason why our shelters in cities are full is because there was no help where people were at. So I'm a big believer around youth homelessness and prevention that we need to help people stay in place. But that means they need better housing and opportunities and safe drinking water and things to do and help when things go wrong, right? And so there's a lot of important work that goes on in this area in Canada, but it's an area, by the way, that the government of Canada on the public service side is absolutely aware of and interested in. but it creates challenges. But the other thing though about small areas is sometimes it creates opportunities. In a small center, it's easy to know everyone, like who the nurse is, who the police chief is, or whatever, who is, you know, like you can make contacts quickly. In big cities, I think dealing with homelessness is really complicated. Like in Toronto, when you have like 70 or so, there's probably more emergency shelters. It's a very fragmented non-system, right? And to create change in that context can be really difficult.
Great. Okay, I think with 1 minute left to go. Oh, David, we have 1 minute left. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I always keep in mind, I don't know if this is too loud in the background, but the bigger the system, the further you are from the decision makers. And then you can like flip that on its head rurally, where you can know everybody, but you know everybody. So it has its own set of challenges that you have to think of. But I would just say always remember, the bigger it is, the further away you are. So you have to get to the right person quicker, I guess. But anyway, I don't want to take the whole time.
No, good point. It's a lot of navigating that is much more challenging. So good point.